Good evening from Washington. I'm Larry O'Connor, and over the years I've had the privilege and opportunity to interview my next guest as a lawyer, a constitutional scholar, a law professor, and a very effective spokesperson on behalf of our founders, our law, federal law, and how things are supposed to be done in this country under our Constitution. Little did I know that he was actually an unindicted co-conspirator. At least that's what Special Counsel Jack Smith would have you believe. He, of course, is John Eastman, founding director of the Claremont Institute Center for Constitutional Jurisprudence and a former attorney of President Trump. And well, see, that's your crime. You actually gave legal advice to President Trump, John. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be back on your show, Larry. Thanks very much.
Were you astounded to see your name included in this indictment?
Well, they didn't include my name, but they included.
What are you,
everything
attorney
else.
number one or something like that?
Number two, because when they're quoting from speeches I gave that are publicly well known, it didn't take hard to go from speculation to confirmation of who unindicted co-conspirator number two was.
Yeah.
But that's the game they're playing. Yeah.
Your participation in advising President Trump in the events leading up to January 6th in the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election involved what?
Well, several things. One, the initial foray into filing a motion to intervene in the Supreme Court in support of Texas's lawsuit, raising very important constitutional questions about the ability of non-legislative officials in states to just alter on their own state election law. That's unconstitutional. Most people, at least prior to 2020, recognized it would be unconstitutional, but partisan advocacy being what it is, a lot of those scholars now back away from their positions. I also advised that contingent electors needed to meet on December 14th if any of the pending litigation went Trump's way. If they hadn't met on the 14th, as the Constitution requires, their votes may not have been able to be counted. And so that was pretty clear with historical precedent out of Hawaii in 1960. And then, of course, I advised that given the illegalities that were conducted, that the state legislators were asking for additional time to assess the impact of that acknowledged illegality. And I advised that Vice President Pence, under his authority under the 12th Amendment, had the authority to delay things for a little bit to let that investigation occur.
Right. And so basically, if I'm understanding this indictment properly, and clearly, surely you will understand it better than I, John Eastman, it sounds like that advice was a criminal act by giving your legal opinion based on precedent, as you just laid out, and based on your understanding of some things maybe that hadn't quite yet been tried or tested in the Constitution. For instance, the vice president delaying the certification of the election, that you in some way committed a crime.
Well, yeah, it's hard to imagine that advice, even advice on disputed issues as these are, and as you rightly point out, never been resolved. They're open questions. Vice President Pence's own general counsel in early December had pointed out the same bit of scholarship and historical precedent that I relied on to make the case that in fact he might have such powers. So the notion that that's a criminal act is based on the claim that somehow that this was all made up, despite the long record. But it's also based on the factual claim that Bill Barr said that there was no evidence of fraud in the election, and therefore we were all supposed to just bend our knee and ignore all the evidence that we had before us to the contrary. And this is what I've called the government's authoritarian tendency, an increasingly authoritarian tendency. When the government speaks, we're all supposed to just, get in line like sheep and not question it, whether it's COVID, masks, Wuhan, vaccines, CRT, transgendered men showing up and exposing themselves in our teenage daughters' showers. All of these things, we're just supposed to be quiet because we're no longer citizens, we're subjects. This is the mentality.
This is a critically important point because, as you know and has already been discussed in various outlets, for Mr. Smith to prove his point, he has to sort of convince a jury that in his heart and in his mind, Donald Trump knew that he lost the election. And the evidence he laid out in the indictment is, well, Bill Barr told him so. And his chief of staff told him so. Well, forgive me, Bill Barr may be the Attorney General of the United States, but he's not the president's personal lawyer. You were.
I was, and also it's also now very clear what we suspected at the time, that Bill Barr did not do the investigations he claimed to have done. In fact, even though he authorizes U.S. attorneys to do election investigations on serious allegations publicly, behind the scenes, he was ordering them not to do the investigations.
Yeah.
This is all well documented now by sworn testimony. So, I mean, and the other thing is he said fraud, but he never mentioned the obvious illegalities that occurred: changing delivery dates, changing registration dates, ignoring signature verification, getting rid of voter ID, all these things that admittedly went on in violation of law, and that made them unconstitutional.
And that was done either by judges or by the executive branch of a state, but not by the legislature as the Constitution lays out. I know this because I interviewed you in the weeks leading up to January 6th, Mr. Eastman. I remember you making this case, and it hasn't been shot down. You're right. I want to come back to something you just said about Vice President Mike Pence. It occurs to me that in the days leading up to January 6th, he was giving speeches to rallies, he was putting out statements. He sure made it sound like he was going to do something that day. Did you get the sense that were you surprised that Vice President Pence had a change of heart?
Well, I did not. I was always a little bit suspicious that he would do anything, but he was certainly putting out notions that maybe he would be, and that maybe he was persuadable, because he was desperately trying to avoid the confrontation that his stance and we now know from his general counsel's testimony in my California Barr trial that they made the decision not to do anything early on, and the rest of this was just hoax on his part, trying to forestall the break with President Trump.
John Eastman, you've been through a lot since this. I think that's an understatement. But you're still standing and you're still fighting. Nobody relishes a moment like this where a former president and current presidential candidate is arraigned in open court and all of the drama and all of the intensity. But I got to ask you, in your own way, are you sort of looking forward to this process playing out so you can finally speak up for yourself, so you can actually finally see it come to some kind of fruition?
Well, with the indictment having been looming over the president's head for a very long time, he was rightly not engaging on those issues. My California Barr trial meant that and they've made it a referendum on all the election challenges, and I've largely been defending the entirety of the election across the country on my own shoulders. So it's very nice to see that other people are now in the position to take up that mantle along with me. But they keep saying there's no evidence, and but the volume of evidence, whether it's Dinesh's work on 2,000 Mules or Mike Gableman's work up in Wisconsin, that demonstrates beyond a shadow of a doubt that there were several 100,000 ballots that were illegally cast and counted in that state, that clearly affected the election where the margin was only 20,000. Heather Honey's work in Pennsylvania showing the same thing. Garland Favorito's work down in Georgia. I mean, the evidence is there. It's just there's this mantra, this narrative that the left-wing media, except for you and a few others, I repeat myself there, keep saying, well, it's been debunked. It's not been debunked. It's clear beyond peradventure that this election was wonky and at least needed to be investigated. And the subsequent investigations that have occurred have demonstrated that the wrong result was certified on January 6th.
John Eastman, sadly, I only have time for literally a 5-second unequivocal yes or no. But during all of those days, all of the discussions, all of the meetings leading up to January 6th, did you have any idea that what would happen at the Capitol that day was going to happen?
None whatsoever. And, we were certainly, if anything, we're the ones that were harmed by it because
exactly. I was looking forward
to
hearing the case made that day. Thank you, John Eastman. Keep standing and we'll have you back. There's more to come on O'Connor Tonight.